For those of you who do not know me, my name is John Carter. When God called me to be a pastor, I never could have imagined how many struggles that came with being called into such a ministry. But many struggles and many pains have I endured during this calling in my life. One of those struggles that I went through was a divorce. And based on the tradition that I had come from, it was my understanding that I was no longer useful for God. It was my understanding that God could no longer use me because I was divorced. And I knew in my heart beyond a shadow of a doubt that God had called me to be a pastor. It was my calling, and I could not reconcile in my heart and mind how I could no longer be useful but yet have this calling from God. The mental and spiritual battles that I experienced during this time in my life were sometimes very much overwhelming. I felt like I had been abandoned by all of those who called themselves my friends. All of my ministerial friends and everybody had abandoned me, and it was very, very painful. Would God ever use me again? Would God ever allow me to be a pastor again? Could God use me at all, since I was now deemed by many of my fellow believers as broken, as used goods? I truly was broken in my heart and in my spirit. I could not find any hope for my future. I could not see a light at the end of the tunnel.
I've shared before that the way God got my attention when I began to feel led a different direction and led down a different career path, aka when God was calling me into full-time pastoral ministry, was to allow me to be fired from a pretty decent paying job with Pepsi-Cola in the Toledo area. That was the one and only time in my life that I had ever been fired from a job, and it wasn't particularly enjoyable. Yet while I am not prepared to blame God for getting me fired, I certainly believe He used it in a profound and powerful way to redirect my life. And the reality is that most of us who have been Christians for very long probably have stories about times in our lives where God used great challenges, brought us through them, taught us a lot about life in the midst of them, and even blessed us in very significant ways, both in the midst of and beyond them. However, when we are in the midst of those struggles, feeling the brokenness and pain, when we cannot see yet the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, those struggles can really wear us down. And sometimes it's hard to know what to do with the brokenness and pain that we are feeling. I mean, even as followers of Jesus, how do we get through from day to day in the midst of brokenness and struggle? Remain hopeful and access the strength we need just to keep going. Well, today as we continue our journey together from brokenness to joy this January at Central Trinity, we move from how God works in the midst of our brokenness to what the Bible has to say about how we deal with it, how we keep going from day to day, hour to hour, even moment to moment, when we are having a difficult time seeing a path through that which we are experiencing. And I want to offer 3 responses from Scripture, 3 ways, if you will, that we can remain focused on God's presence, connected to God's strength, and hopeful for God's future, even in the midst of life's storms. First is this: we remember God's faithfulness in the past. We remember God's faithfulness in the past. For most of us, we can point to situations in our lives, specific instances where God was faithful and brought us through very challenging places. We find examples of this in the Bible over and over as well. From the story of Job in the Old Testament, who lost everything but was blessed immensely because he remained faithful to God even in the brokenness. To Paul in the New Testament, who suffered greatly because of his commitment to spreading the message of Jesus. David, who would become the greatest king in the history of ancient Israel, but who certainly made more than his share of bad decisions, also faced great hardship, yet could look back to the ways that God had rescued him many times. We find an example of this in Psalm 40, verses 1 through 3, where he shares these passionate words from his heart. He says, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and he heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God." The writer of Psalm 66, today's scripture reading, was remembering how God had watched over the people of ancient Israel when they were being pursued by the Egyptian army, and God miraculously parted the waters of the Red Sea so the Israelites could escape through them on dry land, as God led them from slavery in Egypt, ultimately to the Promised Land, that land to which God had promised their ancestors to provide them for a future home. Here in the first 12 verses of Psalm 66, we find the writer reflecting on God's goodness to the people of ancient Israel and offering praise and thanks for the awesome ways that God had worked, acknowledging that, yes, God had allowed the people to endure much, but ultimately had brought them through, all while reflecting on one of the most well-known stories from the Old Testament of the Bible. In fact, the Jewish Passover that we remember every time we receive communion, the Jewish Passover at the time of Jesus, was all about remembering God's goodness in their past and trusting Him in the present when they were no longer a nation, while holding fast to the promises of God that one day He would raise up His people once more. You know, they say hindsight is 20/20. You can't see the future, but you don't have to be a genius to predict the past. Anyone can predict the past, well, so long as we can remember it. The challenge becomes trusting God for the future when dealing with brokenness and pain in the present. It is then that we must look back and remember how God has walked with us and rescued us in the past, just as He often did the people of ancient Israel, until He leads us to our promised land, that place of at least greater strength and joy and peace once again. Secondly, when you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, keep praising God, even when you don't feel all that much at times like praising. Expressing gratitude to God for His care in the past, leaning on those He has placed around you, and knowing that He hears and feels your cries. I will often say to someone that is struggling and wondering why they are going through a difficult place, I don't in that moment try to say why this is happening, but I do tell them that God hurts with you and walks with you in that place. Praising God, even in challenging places, lifts our spirits. It helps us to stay focused on God at times when we are naturally more inclined to focus on ourselves and our struggles. Listen to Psalm 66, again verses 1 through 5 and verse 8, as the writer offers up praise to God. Shout with joy to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of His name. Make His praise glorious. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that even your enemies cringe before you. While all the earth bows down to you, they sing praises to you. They sing praise to your name. Come and see what God has done, how awesome His works on humanity's behalf. Praise our God, O people. Let the sound of His praise be heard. There's just something going on in us as followers of Christ when we begin to praise God for His goodness, even when experiencing tough times. In fact, it also helps keep us from falling into self-pity, from beginning to feel sorry for ourselves and our situations, which can be a really hard place to get out of once we fall into it. In fact, when we fall into that place, it becomes easier to turn away from God and to separate ourselves from those that God has placed around us. That's exactly what the devil wants. He wants you to stop connecting with your Christian friends. He wants you to stop coming to church when you are hurting. He wants you to blame God for your problems. But finding our way through those times in our lives depends on us turning even more toward God, and certainly no less. He knows our struggles. He hears our cries. And in His time, He answers. The answers don't always look the way that we might want them to, but He answers in powerful ways. Don't stop leaning on Him and seeking Him out before the answers arrive. Psalm 18 and verse 6, also written by David, talking about the time when King Saul was trying to kill David. He says, in my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to God for help. From His temple He heard my voice. My cry came before Him into His ears. His point, God hears our cries. God cares about our prayers. Even when we are frustrated and hurting and it feels as if God is taking the day off, He is there with us. Pastor Adam Hamilton says, rejecting God doesn't change the situation that has caused our suffering. It only removes the greatest source of hope, help, comfort, and strength we have. It breaks my heart when I hear about people who have drifted away from God and the church because of one of life's deep struggles. For it is in the community of faith, doing life together and praising God every time we come together, that lifts our spirits, that keeps us focused on the one who can truly heal our brokenness and gives us the hope and strength that we need to keep going, even when the light at the end of the tunnel is elusive. And then a third reason that Scripture offers that will allow us to remain focused on God's presence, connected to God's strength, and hopeful for God's future, even as we walk through the midst of life's storms. It's by looking expectantly to the future, hoping, anticipating what God is going to do, how God is going to work in your life, and even in the midst of that challenge. John Bond, or J.B. as I knew him, was an older man who had come to faith fairly late in life. I say that more, I think it wasn't but a few years older than what I am now. So. But when I first met him, it seemed like he came to faith late in life. But he wasn't a young man, anyhow. Most of his life had been rough. He had a hardened attitude, a life of sort of living on the other side of the law in many ways. But once he yielded his life to Jesus Christ, he became like this big old teddy bear. He was a big guy, but he came like a big old teddy bear who would break down and start crying at a moment's notice whenever he would start to reflect on what God had done in his life. Whenever brokenness or struggle or challenge would come JB's way, he would remember where God had brought him from, literally saving his life, and where God had brought him to. He would look at his situation and he would say, boy, I just can't wait to see how God is going to come through this time. I can't wait to see what God is going to do in this situation. And he was genuine, absolutely confident that the God who had brought him this far was not going to abandon him now. I so love how verse 12 in Psalm 66 is worded. The last part of the verse, After listing all of these struggles that God had allowed the people to endure and God had brought them through, it says, "Yet you brought us out to a spacious place." Other translations of the Bible say, "You brought us to a place of abundance." See, in times of suffering, God will lead us to a better place if we trust Him, even when it's very hard to do so. How do we do this? How do we trust God and have hope even in the midst of difficult places? Well, by remembering how God has come through in the past, by continuing to praise God and to lean on Him and those He has placed around you in the present, and by looking expectantly to the future, refusing to give up or to lose hope, just knowing that just as God has come through for you in the past, He will do so again. As Christians, we know that we have the hope of one day coming into the presence of God beyond all the struggles of this life and beginning an eternity with Him in heaven and those who have gone on before us in the faith. Yet throughout the history of Christianity, Jesus Christ has also brought us hope that we can experience great joy and peace, not just beyond this life, but in this life, and even in the midst of difficult places. Both during and beyond the brokenness and pain that we experience in this life, simply because He is a part of it. Now, sometimes His time and our time doesn't always line up exactly in dealing with the situation. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next week when we look at the story of Lazarus. Now, Lazarus' sister's timing for healing Lazarus and Jesus' didn't line up. But we might ask, why is that? Why in His time? And to answer that, I want to read a short excerpt from a book called "This Day with the Master" by Dr. Dennis Kinlaw, who was a former president of Asbury College and prior to that, former professor at Asbury Seminary. In his book, Dr. Kinlaw writes, "I have a dear friend who had been a Methodist minister's wife. Her husband had died early and she had become a Christian after he died. She was a soul winner and a passionate lover of Jesus. One day I heard that she was losing her eyesight, so I made a trip to see her. I had been in her apartment for about 7 minutes before she shocked me with the question, 'Dennis, you came to comfort me, didn't you?' She asked the question like it was an accusation, and I knew I was guilty. So I said, 'Well, yes, I did.' She looked at me and said, 'Dennis, would you deprive me of the privilege of walking with Christ in the dark? For there are secrets I can learn in the dark that I could never learn in the light.' Not too long after our conversation, Dr. Kinlaw goes on, she regained her sight, and then she lost it completely. But when she walked into total darkness, she walked into darkness embracing it because she did not walk alone. God gives us songs in the midst of our trials and teaches us lessons in the storm we could never learn in the sunshine. Dr. Kinlaw concludes, if you have the eternal God with you, you have the source of all goodness. And if you have the source of all goodness, what else do you need? Hear these words from God's Word. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 28 through 31. Do you not know, have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow tired or weary, and His understanding no one can fathom. Why, He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even young people will grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those whose hope is in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. As you reflect on your own life right now, are you experiencing brokenness? Are you experiencing brokenness, pain, challenges, struggles? Are there places in your life, your family, other relationships, perhaps at work, at school, or in the community where you are struggling to see the light at the end of the tunnel, how God is going to work and this situation is going to end well. If so, remember, God has come through in the past. Keep praising Him and leaning on those He has placed around you in the present. And look expectantly, even before you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, with hope, anticipating that I don't know how God's going to get me through this one, but I know He is. If you do these things, I promise you, the power of God, the presence of God, the peace of God will lead you through. And one day, in one way or another, and it may not be exactly the way we think the situation should be handled, but God will help us to see that light at the end of the tunnel and move into a better place in our heart, our mind, our lives, and our spirit. May we pray. Dear God, we thank you for your promise that you will never leave us nor forsake us. We thank you that you are with us. We thank you, God, that when we are not feeling a lot of hope, we can be hopeful because of you, because of the way that you have worked in our past, because of the way that you have worked in so many different ways throughout the history of your people, that we can praise you and give you thanks even before we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, knowing and believing that you are present, that you are at work, and that if we trust in you, it's going to be okay. God, give all of us hope, strength, peace. Help us, God, to see even ways that you are working. And God, it's hard for us to fathom how good can come out of this struggle. God, I pray your blessing upon each and every one of us this day. May our trust in you and our confidence in you never fail, even in the rougher places, because we know that you have not abandoned us, and you will be there, God, to the very end, not only of that situation, and not only of life in this world even, but forever in your presence. God, that gives us